Good morning. Welcome to the 2026 Aid Budget Breakfast hosted by the Development Policy Centre. I'm Amita Monterola, editor of the Dev Policy blog and co-host of the Dev Policy Talks podcast. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we bring this event, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. From here in Canberra at the Australian National University, we welcome Indigenous leaders, past, present and emerging, who may be joining us. Plus, we'd like to extend this acknowledgement to First Nations people who may be joining us from around the region and around the world. This year, we're coming to you from the Pacific Security College studio in the Crawford School. So I'd like to give a big thank you to the team for lending us this wonderful facility, Megan, Jed, and a special shout out to Cooper. The Dev Poll team has been up all night analysing the federal government's budget announcement to bring you this, our 14th Aid Budget Breakfast. I'd like to welcome our speakers for this morning. We've got Dr. Cameron Hill, our senior researcher, who's been focused on Australian aid through his past roles at the Parliamentary Library and ACFID, and is now at the Development Policy Centre and does also organise the Australasian Aid Conference, which will be held later this year in December here in the Crawford School as well. This morning, he'll give us a rundown on aid in the budget and longer-term trends. And we welcome back also Robin Davies. He's bringing his extensive knowledge of Australia's development program and multilateral organisations to the Development Policy Centre, where he's now managing editor of the Dev Policy blog and also co-host of Dev Policy Talks. He's also a board director at the Burnett Institute and Family PNG Australia. Robin will look at global aid flows, including the latest 2025 data, which was released by the OECD in the last month. Now, the last person we have in the studio is actually behind the camera. Finn Clark is now the research officer maintaining the Australian Aid Tracker. He's taken over from Estelle Stamboli, who's recently started parental leave, and we'd like to thank him for all his work late last night to upload the latest data and getting up early to support us again this morning. Now, online we have Stephen Howes, Director of the Development Policy Centre, who has authored our first piece of analysis, which has already been published this morning at devpolicy.org. And the data is available on the Australian Aid Tracker. We are recording this session and it's going to be available to share with your colleagues later today at Dev Policy YouTube. By the end of the week, we're going to launch our 13th season of Dev Policy Talks with a podcast of this session as well. So I'm now going to go through the event housekeeping while we display Dev Policy's events for the year. I'm going to remind you that you can today use the chat function to send us questions during the presentation. Please state your name and your organisation. Over the next few days, links to the slides, the YouTube recording, our Global Aid blog and our podcast will be promoted on our social media channels. We're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram and X. But the best way to ensure that you get all our information is to go to devpolicy.org and hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner to receive our aid and development blogs and our fortnightly newsletter. Now, we do have a keynote speaker announcement for AAC this Friday, so make sure that you sign up now. And with that, I'll hand over to Cam.
Thanks, Amita, and thanks everyone for joining us this morning. It's terrific to be in this studio for the first time. So I'm going to talk about aid in the federal budget after last night's announcements by the Treasurer. And I just want to start with a quick snapshot, as we do most years, with a look at the budget context. I mean, this budget was delivered in the context of an extreme amount of global uncertainty and was framed, I guess, by two key messages from the Treasurer, both ambition and restraint. And the ambition was on the revenue side with the tax changes that were announced last night. And in terms of restraint, we saw a number of announcements before the budget about reducing growth in things like the NDIS. So you can see from this chart that those decisions are having an effect. You can see that gap between revenue and expenditure narrowing across the forward estimates. And although the budget doesn't balance, there is a marked shift in that gap. And next slide, please. On the aid side, this budget was framed by Labor's 2023 budget measure, which promised a 2.5% increase in total ODA from 2026-27 to 2036-37. And that you can see on the screen there the details of that announcement from the 2023 budget papers. Next slide. So the effect of that measure kicks in next financial year. And when we have a look at the 2025-26 budget versus the 26-27 budget, we can see the impact of that 2.5% coming online. Now, interestingly, what we do see when we compare the forward estimates, the nominal ODA spend across these forward estimates, we do see a shift in the profile of those. The blue line there is last year's budget, and the red line is this year's budget, and you see that change in profile. But overall, you see aid going up in nominal terms, but it doesn't go up by 2.5% over the forward estimates. The average nominal increase over the forward estimates is lower. It's 1.7. So what explains that variance? Next slide, please. And I guess it requires a little bit of work to unpack, as we discovered yesterday and last night. But basically, the way that DFAT is applying this this measure is it's calculating, starting with a base ODA figure, and next financial year that will be 4.87 billion, and it is applying the 2.5% increase to that base, but it's not doing so on a standalone 2.5 at 2.5. It's doing it as an annual increase. It's taking the value of that increase over the forward estimates and applying an average, which fluctuates. And then it is also applying the grant equivalents of its AIFFP loans, and they will they're estimated at 79 million in 26-27, and then it's either adding or subtracting ODA eligible budget measures and adjustments, which total 137 million in 26-27. So it's quite a complex formula, and that's why you see that kind of unevenness and that adjustment in the forward estimates compared to last year. So the effect of that is that real ODA does decrease over, and as Stephen said, I think in the blog this morning, we do see a real decrease compared to 24-25 out to the end of the forward estimates in 29-30. And that's obviously the big hit is the 5% inflation estimate for this financial year. And the fact that you have, slightly less than inflation over the forward estimate. So that's a cumulative real fall in ODA of 7%. And then, of course, ODA GNI also falls from 0.18% in 25-26 to 0.16%. And our projections are that will continue to fall beyond 29-30. The other effect, which is fairly obvious, is that aid also falls as a share of the federal budget. So we see aid as a share of the federal budget falling from an estimated 0.65% to 0.58, so below 60 cents in every $100 that the government spends. And this is obviously moving away from the 1% share of the federal budget that many aid advocates have been calling on the government for. So we're moving further away from that target rather than closer to it. And as we talked about last year, the ratio of defence to ODA spending continues to widen. So this is the projected estimates for defence spending from the recently released 2026 National Defence Strategy and Integrated Investment Plan, plus our estimates and projections that we have on the aid tracker currently. And you can see from this that defence spending is currently about 11 or 11 and a half times aid spending at the moment. And based on these projections, that ratio looks to grow to about 18 to 1 by the middle of the next decade. So that's quite a stark picture. Just looking within the budget that was delivered last night, there were some reprioritizations flagged within the budget, mainly as a response to, I guess, the global uncertainty and the impacts of the Iran war on things such as fuel and food security. So the budget includes a 111 million reduction in global and multilateral funding, including cuts to UNDP and Global Partnership for Education core funding, and the cessation of Australia's core funding for UNAIDS and the Pandemic Fund. There's also a small decrease in aid spending to Middle East and Africa. And within, the main, I guess, beneficiaries of these reprioritizations are country and regional programs within the Indo-Pacific. So Australia's total ODA to the Pacific increases, as does Southeast and East Asia. South and Central Asia has a very small increase. And then there's some increases to some cross-regional and global programs, including the ANCP, the Volunteers Program, and also some increases to Australia's Central Gender and Disability Funds. In terms of sectors, there's not much of a change. Last night's budget did include updated sector estimates, so we can see that governance is still the largest sector by far. The government's predicting that next financial year it will spend about $1.2 billion on governance programs. It's about 1.5 times the next biggest sector, which is economic infrastructure and services, which is around 820 million, I think, estimated for next financial year. So not much change on the sectoral front at all from last night's budget, or on the geographic front for that matter. I just want to turn now briefly to a quick kind of 10-year snapshot and looking at a few of the longer term trends and looking at those trends in the context of the 2014-15 financial year, because that was the final year before the coalition commenced its very large aid cuts, including the $1 billion aid cut that it made in 2015-16. And so if we look at some of these trends, we can see some of the structural changes in the budget that have taken place over the last 10 or so years. In terms of destinations, we can see that over the last 10 or so years that the aid program has become more Pacific and less Indo. So even though over the last decade we've been talking more and more about the Indo-Pacific, our aid program has actually become less Indo-Pacific and more Pacific and less Indo, to put it that way. So the Pacific and Timor-Leste, in dollar terms, in real dollars, inflation-adjusted dollars, have increased by 30%. Southeast and East Asia have decreased by about the same amount. And then we see large cuts and large falls in regions outside that. So South and West Asia down by 50%, Africa and the Middle East down by 75%, and global programs down by 50% as well. So that gives you a picture of the big structural changes that have occurred over the last decade in the wake of those big aid cuts from the coalition. When we look at a couple of sectors, and here I'm going to focus on gender equality and climate, and this is from the data that Australia submits to the OECD DAC. We can see that now we've basically gotten back to what we were spending on gender equality in inflation-adjusted terms as we were in 2014. So, and some of the reduction in between was a result of both reductions in the size of the aid program, but also changes in the way that Australia was applying the gender marker. But we can see basically that also that the significant category, which is aid programs that have a significant but not a principal focus on gender equality, does constitute still the overwhelming majority of our spend. So over 90% of our gender spending is on programs that are rated significant rather than principal. And there's been really no change in the level of principal spending on gender equality. We think this number, particularly on the significant side, will continue to increase as the government's 2023 target on programming for gender equality takes effect. And that applies to all new bilateral regional programs above 3 million. When we turn to climate, we can see a more marked change. So between 2014 and 2024, aid targeting both climate change mitigation and adaptation, both of those have doubled since 2014. Again, like gender, the significant funding really does outweigh principal funding. Over 85% of our spending in both categories has been on programs rated or described as significant rather than principal in terms of their climate change objectives. Again, we're likely to see this increase as the new targets come online as well. Looking at partners, we can see some change here. The multilaterals remain our biggest delivery partner for the aid program. They currently comprise, or in 2024-25, they comprised about 35% or so. But we do see an increase in the share delivered by managing contractors. They're up by about 11% from a decade ago. It's important to recognise, though, that with that contractor spending, some of that funding does flow to other kinds of partners, so non-government organisations, universities, even Australian public sector organisations. So that commercial suppliers category does include large facility type programs where funding does flow through to other categories of delivery partners. And just finally, we can look at the change in terms of how Australia ranks compared to other OECD DAC donors. And we see a fall here in both Australia's share of DAC aid. So we've fallen from 2.65% of DAC aid in 2015 to about 1.9%. That's ticked up a bit, largely as a result of the aid cuts that Robin will talk about shortly. And in terms of our ranking, there's currently 33 DAC donors. And so we've fallen in that ranking over the last decade from 14th to 24th. Again, we've moved up a few places in the 2025 ranking, largely because of cuts by other donors. And that's probably the best segue I have to throw to Robin, who's going to talk about some of the recent shifts in global aid. Thanks, Robin.
All right, thanks, Cam. I just want to fairly quickly put the Australian aid budget in its global context. So I'll go through, I think, 5 charts quite quickly. The overall message, everyone is aware that global aid fell by 23% from 2024 to 2025, which was around $50 billion, and that comes on top of a fall the previous year. So when you put this together, the main message is this is the deepest fall in global aid by any measure since records began back in the 60s. And the second sort of general message is that if you do some projections based on the policy announcements made by some of the donors who are cutting aid, these reductions are likely to continue. And if you go out to about 2028, so 3 years out, it looks likely that aid will be around 40% below its 2023 peak by the time you get to that, by the time you get to 2028. And this is all being done by a group of around 10 donors, of whom 4 or 5 are significant. So that's the general sort of picture. Now, this first slide gives you the historical perspective, the sort of 50-year perspective. ODA has been around a bit longer than this, but the numbers pre-1970 are not particularly reliable. So this, visually it is striking. You see that huge cliff after 2023. There was a 20 billion fall to 2024 and then another 50 billion fall to 2025. So all up around 30% from its peak in 2023. And there's been nothing like that in the prior history of ODA volume fluctuations. In the early 90s, after the Cold War, we saw a fall over a few years of about 18%, but nothing like what we see here. Now, it's true that some of this is undoing an unusually steep climb in ODA in the early 2020s, and that had to do with the counting of in-country refugee costs and aid to Ukraine in particular. Those were a couple of the big factors there, as well as counting of some COVID vaccine costs in the wake of the pandemic. So there's a little bit of unwinding of unusual things going on there, but the majority of the fall is very much driven by deliberate budget cuts beyond those things. Next slide, please. Now this slide represents some projections I've done. I actually went through this exercise a year ago and have repeated it this year. And in brief, I've looked at the policy statements of all of the 34 countries that report to the OECD and aggregated that to come up with a range of possible scenarios for future aid out to 2028. The OECD itself does this too. They do it in a different way. Instead of just looking at everything that has been said, they just ask official donor agencies through a survey for information on future aid levels. And interestingly, what you see here, the top green dotted line, the one that becomes horizontal on the top right there, that was the OECD projection a year ago for what would happen this year and beyond. And as you can see, it's absurdly optimistic. If you go down one, the blue dotted line that becomes horizontal, that's the OECD projection from April of this year. So again, they're feeling more optimistic than I am. That the red line just below that was my projection last year, which was a bit closer to reality, and the red line that extends out to 2028 is my projection for the next 3 years, which leads to a central cut of 40% relative to 2023. And, that's just based on what donors actually say rather than what their officials report to the OECD through the survey. And it's peculiar that there's such a difference. So we're looking at very significant cuts continuing rather than a stabilisation. At least that's a clear point of difference between my projections and the OECD ones. Next slide, please. This slide shows how the realised cuts compare to the cuts that are still to come for the major donors. So as you can see, the United States has done most of its cutting work, but still, it's cut 38 billion so far. It still has another 8 or 9 to go by 2028 based on our best guess. And the same is true of others in varying degrees, but Germany's still got quite a bit to come, another $5.6 billion on top of 12 billion already cut. And then as you go down, you see that some donors like France and the Netherlands actually have the majority of their cutting still to come. Next slide, please. So this shows the same data in a different way, but as you can see, the US share of the realised cuts, which is the column on the left, it's about 60%. But if you take a 3-year view looking out to 2028, the US share of the cuts falls to about 40%, well, no, I think 48% actually, and Germany, France, Canada and others become more significant. And the final slide. So this is, again, the view from 2023 out to 2028, segmenting the donors into those who have announced cuts as a matter of policy. The donors I'm calling the programmatic ODA cutters. So that's the dark blue lines. That group accounted for about 75% of ODA in 2023 before the cuts really began. And when they're done, their ODA will be about half of what it was in 2023. The rest of the DAC remains really quite flat. They don't do any further damage, but nor do they offset the cuts from the programmatic cutters. I've displayed Japan separately because it's in an odd position. It has not announced policy cuts, but it is declining for reasons to do with the composition of its program, the split between loans and grants over time. So that's the overall picture. I have more behind that, but I'll stop there and we'll go to questions.
Thanks, Robin. Now, we do have a very generous amount of time this year, about half an hour for questions. So I'm looking forward to seeing questions come through on the chat. We have a chat session open, and I can see we are just now getting a few questions in. But I did want to indulge the panelists today on just one detail that I picked up on. Obviously, a topic very close to my heart, but I just wanted to talk about some of the drops in funding for the multilateral organisations. I think it was UNAIDS and the Pandemic Fund that were listed along with the Education Fund. So I was just wondering if, Cam, you could explain exactly what's happening there.
Sure. Yeah. So in the case of so UNDP is getting a $3 million cut to its core funding. So that funding was suspended last year, and next year will resume, but at $3 million. So usually Australia provides $13 million to UNDP core funding, and that will go down to 10 from next year. There's not an amount in terms of the reduction for the Global Partnership for Education. I think that might be still an ongoing replenishment discussion, but there is a flagged reduction in that core funding. In the case of UNAIDS and the Pandemic Fund, yes, the government has said it will cease core funding to both those multilateral organisations. I think the future of UNAIDS is kind of uncertain with a lot of the restructuring going on, and I think it looks like UNAIDS will be absorbed into other parts of the UN, its functions, and the government has also said that doesn't signal it is stepping away from responding to HIV/AIDS in our region. It's just doing it through its bilateral and regional programs. And the Pandemic Fund was quite a recent initiative set up, I think, in the wake of COVID. And Australia did make an initial contribution to that. It has said it will honour that existing contribution, but not provide a new contribution in the next replenishment.
Okay, obviously with the AIDS crisis in Fiji, that's the big thing that's on our mind here in our region. And Australia has obviously started a response package in Fiji, but perhaps we'll have more details on that that might come to light. I'm going to go to a question that is following up on those points from Lauren Ellis Luckhurst from the British High Commission. And she's just interested on the data on how much of these multilateral contributions are earmarked to the Pacific and Southeast Asia in these larger funds.
I know that for the banks in particular, and I think DFAT makes a point of this in its budget document, the banks have increased both their funding and their presence in the Pacific Islands. And some of that has obviously been at the urging of Australia. Australia obviously provides most of its multilateral funding as earmarked funding, and much of that is for the Pacific or Southeast Asia. We're relatively low in terms of our ranking of core funding. So when you look at that share of the Australian aid program that's delivered through multilateral agencies, a a portion of that is core, but a bigger portion of it is earmarked. I think the bigger question for Australia is, we're obviously this happened last year in the wake of the global aid cuts. We reprioritised, and where we seem to always reprioritise from is multilateral core funding. But at the same time, we're also saying to those multilateral agencies and the other governments that contribute to them, we want more of this money to come to our region. And I think there's a tension there. If our core funding is going down, I guess our ability to persuade or influence these agencies to spend more of their core funding in our region, will also, I think, be lessened. So that's a dilemma I think the Australian government faces in continually reprioritising away from multilateral core funding.
And a follow-up question from Sadhna Sen on that particular topic. Do multilaterals go through rigorous evaluations to ascertain the effectiveness of their aid delivery in the Pacific? Is there also a conversation going on here, not only about priorities, but also aid effectiveness between Australia and the multilaterals?
Yeah, well, I mean, Australia, I think, subjects multilateral agencies to strategic assessments, I think once every 2 years. And most recently in its Performance of Australian Development Cooperation report, there is quite some detail, I guess, on those assessments, some good summaries. I think those multilateral agencies, like all development organisations, have their strengths and their weaknesses. But there has been a lot of work, I think, from Australia in particular to, enhance their effectiveness in the Pacific, enhance their presence, enhance their oversight. But again, it does come down to that question of, well, if we're decreasing our core contributions, it's going to be harder for us to make those kinds of demands on them, I think.
So we'll move on to a question from Nathan Hansford from IDCC, so the contractor community. Do you have a view on the path of ODA funding to the Pacific versus the other parts of the world, especially the Indo, as you pointed out, in the coming years? Will it be a new paradigm where Australia is increasingly focusing on its region, with development playing its role as one of the arms of statecraft? I think this is
okay.
Definitely a question for you.
There's no doubt that Australia's aid program has always focused on its region. I guess its definition of its region has become narrower over time. So the Pacific, the government talks about 75% of its aid going to the Indo-Pacific. I think, that's kind of basically been the same for the past few years. I think this year it might have gotten up to 76%. But of that 76, so 42% of Australia's aid goes to the Pacific. So well over half of that Indo-Pacific aid goes to the Pacific. About 25% goes to Southeast and East Asia, and it's, I think, now down to about 7 or 8% goes to South Asia, Central Asia. So yeah, we're definitely seeing more concentration on the Pacific. And, we see year to year, particularly from about 2017, 2018, more and more Australian aid going to the Pacific, and that's been the only region that has seen real growth in spending over the last decade or so, is the Pacific, by about 30%. So I guess whether that continues or whether that's kind of peaked, I guess, is an open question. I mean, some would argue that the kind of marginal effectiveness of increasing more and more aid to the Pacific and the Pacific's absorptive capacity is probably questionable. In terms of other arms of statecraft, I guess, yes, there's things like policing, all sorts of, work in areas like banking, obviously work around Pacific labour mobility and migration. I think, a number of those are, really important. And again, they've been happening for a long time. We've had a big policing presence in the Pacific for a while now. I mean, it's grown, but it's always kind of been there. It's always been a feature, even during the Howard governments. I think that will continue. But again, I guess I would ask the question, if we're saying that this other work has a development impact, it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to demonstrate it. So it's easy to say that, well, our security work has a development impact. But it would be great to see an evaluation of the development impact of some of these programs that looked at them through the lens of development, rather than, just kind of a narrow definition of national interest or something else.
Well, we might stick with a little bit more on the core aid and in particular the Pacific. I've got two questions here. One is from Sophie Hardfeld from ActionAid, and another one from Jocelyn Condon, who's now the CEO of Family PNG Australia. First of all, Sophie's asking, what are your reflections on their indexation calculations? And she's asking about the Australian Infrastructure Fund for the Pacific not being included. And Jocelyn's just also very keen to understand what DFAT's approach is about counting the grants component of the loans.
Yeah, so I guess the 2.5% was more complicated than we thought it would be. I think we and others in the sector kind of thought of it as a year-on-year 2.5% increase on total ODA the year before, but that's not the way it's working. My understanding is that it's not considered kind of good budgetary practice to apply these things to grant equivalents, probably because those grant equivalents are quite lumpy. They can shift around from year to year. It makes the application of that 2.5% a bit more complex if you're trying to do it on top of a lumpy kind of spend on grant equivalents as the loans from AIFFP are dispersed. So I guess my understanding is that it's not seen as good practice, but I do think it does kind of take some of the sheen off the 2.5% indexation. And obviously the other thing to note is that it doesn't keep up with inflation, particularly this year. And I guess we can question whether the Treasury's forecasts for future inflation are a bit optimistic, given this crisis doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. I mean, I think on the grant equivalents, I mean, these loans are now kind of an established part of Australia's engagement in the Pacific. They will, most of those loans are in PNG at the moment. That accounts for the lion's share of AIFFP loans. And I guess, we are likely to see a kind of variation in the disbursement patterns of those loans, because those loans are for, very complex infrastructure projects, in countries like PNG, which are, more difficult to deliver infrastructure projects in. So I think it's entirely legitimate for the government to count the grant equivalent of these loans under DAC rules. The formula on which you do so is quite complicated, but it is allowed under OECD DAC rules, and other donors that lend, like Japan and others, France, also count them.
And I should note that, Cam, you do have a number of blogs on the Infrastructure Fund on devpolicy.org. So if you guys want some more background on that, please look up those blogs. I think we'll just go to one more question around ODA eligibility and ODA rules, since we're on that topic. Grace Stanhope from the Lowy Institute, thanks for your comment. And she's interested in your thoughts on ODA graduation and how it's affecting our spend, especially in the Pacific, and how you see that trend playing out in coming years. Either Cam or Robin can take that question, obviously.
Yeah, I might say a couple of things and then Robin can jump in, I think. So, I mean, the one that's raised in the context of the budget is Nauru, which is expected to graduate from to a high income status next year and graduate from ODA eligibility, and that will affect how we count our spend in Nauru. It will probably move into that non-ODA category, which is currently in the budget in a small amount. Other countries, I think, like Cook Islands, have graduated. I think Australia has a different view from probably many other DAC donors about the treatment of SIDS in their ODA eligibility. I'm sure that it will continue to have those discussions with other donors in the DAC. But I guess it does raise the question of what a broader non-ODA partnership to small island countries look like, and I guess what other examples are out there that Australia could look at or take. There's obviously New Zealand's arrangement with Cook Islands, but there may also be other examples around the world of what those partnerships look like. Did you want to chime in there, Rob?
Not a lot to add, and this is very much a small island state issue. There's no sort of wave of countries that are about to graduate globally. It's a very high bar to achieve high income status, as we see from the case of Ukraine, for example, which is still ODA eligible.
I guess one of the other things, maybe just a note, is Nauru's graduation, as Stephen and our colleague Rabiat have written as well, is partly based on the income it receives from fishing licenses, which have been quite positive, but also Australia's another arm of Australian statecraft, if you like, is providing very large amounts of money to Nauru for taking out asylum seekers, and so that is part of the reason its income level has shot up.
And we did have a very interesting analysis of that from in a different context with Maho writing about PNG and the Manus economy, taking money from asylum seekers. Now, Robin, I might move to you and look at talking more about the OECD donor trends, but we do have a question from Bill Walker. He's just interested in how the aid that China gives fits into your picture.
Yeah, so if you look at the aid from non-DAC donors generally, it's becoming more significant, but it's still quite small. It's sort of drifted up from about 8 or 9 billion in sort of 2015 to around 15 or 16 billion per annum these days. Of course, the numbers are very rubbery, particularly for China and some of the others, but some non-DAC donors report to the OECD, and in other cases, including China, the OECD does publish estimates. And it's made very difficult by the fact that you can't always tell how much of the flows in question are truly ODA-like as opposed to commercial. But the OECD's best guess is still that the aggregate is pretty small at around $15–16 billion a year. So it helps, but it certainly does not offset the recent cuts, and it does not appear to be growing at any great rate. Its rate of growth has been quite low.
Just a technical question from Mark Rice at Results on the US figures that you've used. Obviously, the US Congress has voted to reinstate some of the aid funding that the Trump administration had originally proposed cutting. Do your projections allow for that Congress potentially blunting those cuts, or how did you deal with that?
Yeah, well, and we saw that last year, that the desired cuts from the Trump administration were not fully enacted. Congress pushed back quite hard on some things, including some global health funding. And the actual outcome it sort of turned out somewhere between what the Trump administration wanted and what Congress wanted, because the Trump administration was able to go very slow. The Office of Management and Budget can basically keep the tap off for quite long periods. So I think we will see that sort of tussle every year for at least for the next couple of years, where Congress does push back, but the amount that is finally delivered is somewhere between what Congress wanted and what the administration wanted, and that's how the projections have been calculated.
We might try to cover a few more types of aid within the budget. We do have a question from Ashley Betteridge, who is a past employee of the centre, and we should give due credit to Ashley for setting up the Australian Aid Tracker. So look, she has a huge amount of experience in this field, and she is surprised that there's no increase over the forward estimates for some areas such as humanitarian aid. She's saying that it's barely shifted from the 500 million or so from as long as she can remember. I was just wondering if Cam, you wanted to make any comments on that. Robin, I'm not sure if you've been able to have a look into those figures yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think DFAT is estimating, I think, a total humanitarian flow, I think, of around 700 million. There's a figure in the PBS, I think, which is always around 500, which might be the one that Ashley's referring to, which is, a core humanitarian budget. I think it also includes refugees and so on, but there are a number of different programs which contribute to DFAT's humanitarian estimate and DFAT's humanitarian spend. Look, I think, as Stephen raised in the blog this morning, there's an open question around, I guess, the length of this crisis and the kind of the scale of Australia's response, including in humanitarian. So, the World Food Programs are estimating that 45 million additional people could be facing acute hunger very soon. And I guess beyond our region, there is, I think, a question about whether our humanitarian funds really, is fit for what's happening now and what could be coming, particularly, there were already massive humanitarian needs built up in the system and declining funding, as Robin talked about. And now, this crisis is adding to that. And, we haven't seen, I guess, big shifts in Australia's global humanitarian funding for quite a while, including the Humanitarian Emergency Fund, which I think is still at 150 million, and it's been that way for quite a while, and certainly not increased in nominal or real terms. It's declined in real terms. So yeah, I think there's a question of adequacy around that funding, particularly the Global Humanitarian Fund funding. And I guess I would note that on page 1 of DFAT's budget summary, it talks about profound transformation of the global development landscape. And I guess, as Stephen said in his blog today, there's a question over whether this budget has really changed much from what the government was thinking about before the war. And it does acknowledge this profound transformation. I guess the question is whether the numbers reflect some of the language in this document.
So on that theme of crisis and conflict, we have a question from Ellie Torres, which is looking at she's stating obviously that the International Development Policy, which DFAT had put out in the last few years, does recognise the importance of peace, stability and conflict prevention. We've currently got a joint parliamentary committee inquiry into this particular subject, and here at the centre we've had Cameron, Nimat Bijan and also Terence Wood contributing to that inquiry. You can look at their contributions either in the inquiry website or our own devpolicy.org publications directory. And Ellie is asking here whether the current aid budget looks like it's supporting long-term investments in peace building, social cohesion and conflict prevention.
Yeah, so I think there's a slight there is an increase in one of the budget lines around that. My understanding is that it's the result of a contribution to a peace building fund that so global peace and security contributions go up from 92 million to 111 million next financial year. So there is, that in that line item, I guess. But I think more broadly, there's a question around, and this was raised in the OECD DAC review, around the kind of overall coherence around Australia's approach to this issue. Where should Australia focus? I guess that was one of the issues we discussed with the Joint Standing Committee. I mean, one of the concerns, I guess, is that we are, continuing to ask the aid program to do more and more, some quite big things: stability, prosperity, and alongside climate, gender equality, all these important things that the aid program is trying to do. I guess the question I would have is what's the kind of the strategy that might sit around that, and where would we focus? Because I think the risk is that we continue to pull the aid program in many directions and don't really make choices about focus. And I think if we were to take up this agenda in a serious way, we would need to probably focus it, and I would suggest that focus should be in the countries of Melanesia and Timor-Leste.
I think that you may have answered one of the other questions that we've got online from Heidi Winder from Tetra Tech, looking at Australia's role in the region and perhaps where we could choose to put our priorities. So I think that one of the other points is obviously climate change, climate resilience. And Nick McClellan's just asked whether there were any details on whether Australia is putting in a specific package, perhaps, for the pre-COP and COP meetings. I know in past budgets they had built that in, but I'm not sure if it's explicit in the documents that you've seen so far.
I think there are, from memory, Nick, some new measures around Australia's hosting of COP. That's a mix of, I guess, ODA, non-ODA funding to do with the, support for the Pacific element of that, which Fiji and Tuvalu will be involved in. But I guess more broadly, the government has, packaged its $550 million contribution grant capitalisation of the infrastructure fund as a climate measure, to the extent that that fund does, or that facility does, include a focus on renewable energy and climate proofing infrastructure. So that's part of, I think, its packaging of its approach to COP. And then also it's, I think there was a budget measure last year around Australia's $100 million contribution to the Pacific Resilience Facility, and I think rejoining the Green Climate Fund. I think on the kind of aid front, Australia is going to be the biggest donor to the PRF, the Pacific Resilience Facility, and it has flagged that its focus, with the Pacific, will be attracting other donors into that fund through this COP. Again, I think it raises this tension between Australia's kind of, declining core multilateral funding, but then asking other donors to provide more funding to our region at the same time. But yeah, I think the big focus will be trying to increase the capitalisation of the PRF through the COP process.
I'm just going to touch on a couple more things before we wrap up. And we have had Sue Ahern online. Good morning, Sue. I think we'll just take a note that there has been some increased funding for the Indo-Pacific broadcasting strategy and media development work in the Pacific. I'm not sure that any of us have yet had time to have a look at that particular topic. Yeah. But certainly I think Sue has put down that it's the Australia Asia Pacific Media Initiative that has gained more funding, as well as the ABC overall as well. So hopefully those things do, the ABC general funding, core funding, will flow into supporting Pacific reporting, which is obviously a very big part of our job here at Dev Policy as well. Robin and I do co-edit the blog, And we not only publish a blog that the text and images go to our own website, but they are distributed to partners around the Pacific by our coordinator Sadhna Sen. So we do have a very big interest in this area, and hopefully we can get some more information on this spending in the future. I just wanted to finish off with a few more questions that might bring us to a bit of a conclusion, but also perhaps some action on the part of some people. Jessica Morris from the Quakers Australia is asking, given that the global and local trends of ODA spending are deeply concerning, particularly in comparison to military funding, which again we've written about and published, particularly Cameron, on the blog. Do you have views about opportunities for challenging these trends? And I just wanted to note too that David Bailey was also noting whether there could be possible sources of funding from the private sector as well.
I might have a go. Look, I think the aid industrial complex is certainly dwarfed by its military counterpart, and will, as we've seen from those forward projections, will continue to be so. I mean, I'm no defence spending expert. There are lots of people who've commented on the adequacy or otherwise of Australia's defence spending over the next period, and many of those defence experts say we're not spending enough, but we need to also be spending it better. So I guess one issue around that defence spending is is it being used as effectively as it can be, and that's a debate that community will have. I guess I would say that there's been a lot of talk about the end of aid, and particularly over the last year, new paradigms and all sorts of things, including potential roles for the private sector. I mean, I guess my basic viewpoint on this is the use of public finance to solve shared problems is not going away. It's not going to go away. And whatever we call it, whatever paradigms we say it is or isn't, this question of countries having to pool funding, pool technical expertise, is just going to keep coming up, and probably coming up more in the world that we're facing. So, even though it's been a really challenging year for aid and so on over the last couple of years, I just think that basic question of like public resources for shared transnational, global, regional problems is always going to be there, and it's not going to go away. Robin, did you want to add anything to that?
Just that, in the end, aid is always driven by, and always has been driven by, circumstances that we could never foresee. And while money is being drawn away from aid budgets toward defence budgets at the moment, if we see an acceleration of conflict, inevitably the pendulum will swing back the other way. And the same would be true of other global threats, pandemics, environmental disasters, and so forth. Eventually, the pendulum swings back.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks, Cam. We are, of course, going to continue this conversation every day. We are publishing blogs. Well, I was going to say every day, but actually that's not completely true. There's one day in the week where we now don't publish a blog, and that the only day is Sunday. We are now publishing from Monday to Saturday. So please keep your eye on our social media channels, and also subscribe on our website. And we will be continuing the discussion at the Australasian Aid and International Development Conference later this year in December. We have all the details about the call for paper in another month's time. And we are looking forward to everyone joining us here at the Crawford School again this year. Now, thanks to everyone who's tuned in today, and those watching back on YouTube or listening via our podcast. You can follow our social media channels, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and X for links to slides and those recordings. Don't forget to subscribe for our fortnightly newsletter for all the latest DevPol news. This is the 14th Budget Breakfast since the Centre's first event in 2013. In that time, the DevPol team has built a massive resource called the Australian Aid Tracker. So I can see that there's been some other questions in the chat, and a lot of those questions can actually be answered by that great resource. So we need to acknowledge the work that past employees such as Ashley Betteridge and our academics, Terence Wood, have put into that, and our current staff, Sharon Liu, Estelle Stamboli, and Finn Clark. And an extra thank you again to Finn Clark for organising this morning's webinar, and we'll see you at the next Dev Policy event.
Thanks, everyone.